Denise, Gwen. Reading aloud for you from my short story, The Greasy Spoon, Chapter 1. Two lawyers walked into a coffee shop and stood in the breezeway for a moment, shuffling around uncertainly in their black leather wingtips, their hands shoved deep inside their pockets, until a waitress walked past them with a pot of coffee in her hand and said, "Go on and take a seat," and walked over to the booth of a solitary customer and topped off his coffee. And as she did this, the two lawyers looked at one another and nodded and walked over to the booth behind the customer drinking his coffee and reading the Parkersburg Gazette. Nothing dangerous in that, after all. Before they sat down, they pulled off their dress jackets and turned them inside out to protect the fabric, and placed their jackets, lining side out, along the rim of the booth seat, and sat down on opposite sides of the table and looked at one another as the waitress approached the table with a pot of coffee. "Coffee?" "Yes, please," Nick said. "Me too," Ed said. There were two ceramic coffee cups perched upside down on two saucers, and the waitress plucked up the cup closest to Nick by its handle, turned it right side up, set it back down on the saucer, and poured a piping hot stream of coffee into it, then repeated the process for Ed. The acrid, pungent aroma of freshly brewed coffee assailed Nick's nostrils, and he closed his eyes as a distant memory of the smell of coffee beans took him briefly to another place, one he hadn't thought of in a long time. "You got any Splenda? Stevia?" Ed asked. The waitress nodded at the dusty plastic container pushed up against the wall and with a curl of peeling wallpaper resting on it. It contained sugar packets and the pink stuff, saccharin, the shit that gave lab rats cancer. "That's all we got. You want cream?" Yes, please," Ed said. She turned on her heel and walked to the kitchen. Nick reached for a sugar packet, opened it, poured it into his coffee, and stirred. The waitress returned a moment later bearing a small silver container with a lid on it. She set it down by Ed's cup. It left a soft, white, milky ring on the table from where the cream had jostled slightly when she set it down. "All right," Ed said. "Thanks." She held the pot of coffee above their heads. If she wanted to, she could fling the piping hot coffee onto their asshole twat faces. And for one sharp second, Nick sensed she was seriously considering it. He smiled up at her. The look in her eyes dimmed. "You guys want menus?" "Yes, please, ma'am," he said, and smiled.